animation world, and thank you for joining me again for another Anima-saurus. Today I'm very lucky to have in the studio with me Krista Jordan, who's the head of animation at AFTRS. Welcome to the microphone, Krista.
Hey Kim, nice to be here.
Now, just for everyone who's just not met you before, which I don't think would be very many people, can you just give a quick rough down of who you are, where you are at the moment?
Cool. Yeah, my name's Krista Jordan, as noted, and I am the head of animation, and I look after visual effects as well as in that sort of bundle. And I'm at the Australian Film, Television, Radio School, otherwise known as AFTRS. We're based in Sydney, but we do lots of remote learning and lots of other activities, and we are considered to be one of Australia's premier screen story school and radio school, and we've been around for 45 odd years, and we've got some stellar alumni out there in the industry.
45 odd years that they've actually been there, which is quite impressive. Have they
Yep.
always been in that little the space at Moore Park? Have they always been
No,
down there?
no. Originally, we were out in North Ryde, and what most people don't know is that we're actually essentially a government body. We are there in support of the Australian creative industries, both radio and screen, and our remit is to produce the best students in Australia, to support industry, and to make sure that we can grow a healthy and vibrant screen community and radio community.
Oh, brilliant! You got the promo package down. That's great.
I did. But it's true. That's why I love it.
That's why you love it. That's why you're passionate about actually doing that sort of stuff now. So
100%.
but your career didn't always start off here. So let's just wind back really, right back to the start. What got you started in this creative space that you start working in?
Yeah, well, I'm very old. I don't look that old. I'll say that now. I try not to be too old. But when I started out, I really didn't have an understanding of what was available out there. There was, I'm pre-internet, all that sort of stuff. And I'm actually the daughter of a fine artist. So I've always loved creatives industry. I've always had art around me. I was really interested in graphic design. I used to love animation. I always watched a lot of animation, but I didn't really understand that could actually be a career for me because it seemed so remote as a possibility. And I actually started by studying visual communications at UTS with the sense that, graphic design might be where I ended up. So I didn't start there. And in terms of animation and screen. And, when I started particularly working in the screen space, in fact, one of my very first jobs, ironically, was as a digital cell painter in a little company in Artarmon, otherwise known at that time as Unlimited Energy. And that was my first virtual job in virtual craft in animation, strangely, pretty much straight out of university. And I worked, 2 weeks on during the day and 2 weeks at night. I was on less than minimum wage, I suspect. So it was a bit of a, you just got to get in there and get started. And I learnt some stuff in that space that carried forward. And then, I had various jobs in different spaces. I was an art director on a magazine. I had my own little graphic design studio. And I landed in the company, one of the many little jobs that I had at that time called it was Omnicon, and Omnicon in Sydney did a lot of advertising work. We had edit suites, and it was right at the ground floor when visual effects was starting, and I got the opportunity to use softwares and things that I'd never seen before. And so I was pretty much just get in and give it a crack and teach yourself. So I've learnt I could count on it would take more than two hands to count all the softwares that I've had to kind of get in and learn by myself. There was no courses for me. I couldn't go to and do a Flame course. I couldn't go and do a Maya course. That wasn't available to me. So I just kind of learn on the job.
Yeah, which is I guess especially in the start, that's what most people wanted was an attitude that just said, oh yeah, I can understand a computer, I can turn it on, and yeah, everything else will just pick up and as you go.
And that's true still today. That ability and that agility to move around things, particularly now, in fact, is a really useful thing. There's so much, so many tools, so many virtual tools and digital tools, if you want to use that word, that are available to you in order to be able to, particularly in our industry often, which is moving from job to job, and you might need to move from one sort of workflow style with one set of tools to another workflow style with another set of tools. That capacity is really important. And so, you know, when you have a craft under your belt, if it's animation, if it's whatever your craft is, it's about understanding how to apply that craft and how to navigate new tools. Like, tools are just tools. It's how you use them that's the real sort of magic.
Yeah, it's the soft skills that you learned about, your creative eye and how you apply the knowledge that you have. You said, the tools, a hammer's a hammer, no matter what you hit it with.
Yeah, someone can, you know, mishit a nail with a hammer, or someone could build a house. So, you know, where do you sit on that curve?
Yeah. Oh, so that gets you in there. So what was that's in very random sort of things. Did you get into any fun roles that you kind of remember? You know,
that you picked up on? I've had huge opportunities, and most of those come from those relationships where, you know, people I've worked with, incidentally, then have recommended me for other jobs. And that's actually how I ended up at Anima-Logic in the very early days. It was through a recommendation of someone who thought I had the right sort of attitude for the role. And I ended up in the design department at Anima-Logic, which was hugely, you know, fortunate. And I grew up inside Animal, and I worked really hard and got to work on some amazing shows and had some amazing opportunities. And that is really how I learnt my craft, is by being surrounded in it and learning a lot of it on the job and being motivated and hardworking in that process. It's a bit different now. I think now, if I was growing up now, you know, there's so many great courses that you could go and do, and so many things that you could teach yourself. There's so many resources out there in the world that you can have access to. And in fact, if you're motivated, you know, self-motivated and interested, you can create so much amazing stuff and build a portfolio for yourself without even necessarily having to, you know, have worked anywhere in particular.
That's one of the things, like, modern technology now is really amazing. Like, I love, you know, the idea that everyone's got a camera in their pocket now means you can be a filmmaker at any point, or a storyteller at any point, just by actually whipping out your camera. You can cut together a few clips just by wandering around. And it's a great way of crafting your skills, like developing your crafting skills without much of an outlay from what you've already got.
One of the places that people fall down is in that space is not thinking about the continuum of screen story and thinking about the history of film and where things come from, you know. So you can do it, but what does that mean? Like, where does that sit in the continuum of screen story, and who's your audience? Like, what is it that you want to say? You know, there's lots of people, you can cut a few pretty pictures together, but at the end of the day, what does it mean, and what does it mean to you, and what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
You know, I think it's really important for particularly Australian creatives to really embrace an understanding of, you know, the stories that they love, and trying to tap into that and understand, you know, try to get a better understanding of who they want to be as a creative, rather than just going out and doing stuff.
Because the idea of telling I've come across this as well, the idea of telling Australian stories and actually using a lot of our background to tell Australian stories is something that's not really done that much. And if it is, it's not getting the exposure that it needs, because we've got a lot of talented people. I'm
going to jump in there and say, you know, that the outstanding current sort of model that's really, really obvious and prevalent in the world, and it's part of a continuum, is you know, Ludo Studio and, you know, Bluey, right? So that is an outstanding you know, series. It's very Australian, uniquely Australian. It looks Australian, it sounds Australian, uses Australian accents. The Ludo team, you know, they adapt their work to all different mediums and all different types of screens. They're very agile. They have engaged audiences all around the world, because even though it's an Australian story, it's got a unique flavour and it's interesting. It's not just part of that homogenous experience out there in the world, but it tells essentially human stories that everybody can relate to, that kids can relate to around the world in a really unique and beautiful way. And that is, if you think about it, part of some of the continuum in the Australian experience. Skippy was a huge success around the world because that still told great stories, but with a unique Australian flavour. You know, Blinky Bill was another one. You know, the Magic Pudding. There is a rich continuum of Australian style stories that people often forget about and don't recognise as part of that continuum. So I will say we don't do it enough, but there are many awesome examples that demonstrate that we can and we should. And in fact, you know, in terms of that great Indigenous sort of storytelling opportunities in animation, you've got Little J and Big Cuz and Little J, the animated series. Fantastic series. It tells great stories. It's got a very eclectic mix of characters. You know, it's very well received all around Australia. And again, doing great works, telling great, you know, stories through an Indigenous lens in a rural setting with an eclectic mix of, you know, diverse Australians with all sorts of, you know, stories to tell that really engage people's interests and, you know, touch us in a way that is connecting us. Yep. And I think that's a great thing.
And another interesting thing coming along with storytelling is the way we're actually telling stories now. We were just talking about, you know, camera language and the history of how you actually get up to telling a nice story. But the platforms now, which are getting a lot of high exposure, you can change your view on. Like if you look at something like TikTok, it's, you know, very short and to the point. But there's also some animators now lending towards doing real short little 8-second stories, and they're getting exposure that way as well. So they're understanding of storytelling is being adapted to short form, real short form. So
absolutely. And again, that's about research and understanding your audience. Some of that, for many of them, is instinctive. Obviously, it taps into something that they respond to well. But if you're a storyteller and you want to explore those spaces, or you're an animator, and I really recommend you do your research. You know, the underpinning of any great kind of animation is research, research, research. When you're building a character, you're researching your characters. So apply that same sort of discipline to who's my audience, what's my platform, what are people going to respond to, and then, you know, then you can actually make sure that you're adapting or adjusting your storytelling or your style to accommodate and best be presented in that format. And that's a really important thing to do as well.
Oh, yeah, some really good points. I mean, we got into you being in Animal Logic. What was what was your main role through that? Was because I know.
Oh my God, I have changed roles so many times through my career. I have that's one of the things. It's one of the great things, I think, in some ways, is that I get bored, I suspect. And so I like to sort of zig and zag and change spaces. So I've worked in the design department. There was a period when I was working on flame suites, on lots of advertising stuff. I've worked in you know, film. I've worked in series work. I've worked in the recruiting team. I've done learning and development and teaching. I've been in HR. At one point, I left Animal Logic and I was the HR and recruiting, head of HR and recruiting at Flying Bark. And what that has taught me is that the more I understand the whole industry, the people, you know, how it works in the business side of things, you can't ignore the fact that what we do is actually not fine art, right? If you want to do fine art, that's fantastic, but you do that in service of yourself. You know, there are many artists out there who might never sell a painting, but they're compelled to do what they want to do. What we do is not that. What we do is in service, usually, of either, you know, somebody else's story, or we're developing a story so that we can leverage it and get an audience for it, and ideally be able to generate an income from it. So I'm acutely aware that it's actually a business that we're in, and it's not fine art, and fine art has a business component to it as well for many, you know, on that side. But, you know, what we do is in service of a whole lot of other requirements. And the more I understand all of those things, the people, the resourcing, the business side of things, the tools, all of that stuff really helps me to have a better understanding of how to, at this time in my life, having, done a lot of teaching and lecturing and stuff, to help guide people and to have a better understanding of how they might adapt their skills and work in the industry. A lot of people just think, even now, that animation is just about animators, and that's not actually the case. There is a huge number of roles available to you, and you could do amazing work and work with amazing creative people if you're good at, if you're really well organized. You could be in production. If you love the law, you could work in, IP management and, helping people to be able to manage and sell their beautiful stories. And you could work, if you're great at, dealing with people, or you're a really good HR manager, you could work in that space. There's so many places for people to engage in, creative industries with all sorts of different skills. And the more we do that, the richer the pool of fabulous people working in creative industry.
Yeah, the work that goes into a production, like you said, especially with production managers and people managers, and while a lot of times, especially as a student, I know you just kind of think, oh, you're just actually creating the art, but there is so much more to creating the art. Like you said, it is a business after all. There's so much more to that people don't realize, especially when you're learning the business. It's only once you've been around it a few times and you've actually talked to people and you walked into different studios that you realize there's so many different skill sets which go into being 100%. That artist. So
it's a team sport. It's like, often I think of it, if you think of it a little bit like the construction industry. So if you think of any sort of creative screen story as a building, a bit like a building, you always start with the foundations, and there's different specialists coming in to do different things. So you've got your plumbers and your electricians, and they come in, and then you've got your plasterers and your people who make it look good, the engineers who make it work right, you've got the people who are going to sell the building. There's a lot of for me, there's a lot of parallels in that space. And that in virtual craft, the idea that you can just keep changing things just because you can, that's not an efficient use of virtual craft. And understanding the benefits of really good development processes and research and storyboarding and doing the work up front can save you a lot of time and angst, and actually getting used to iteration and not being afraid of having to put your work up in front of people and have them talk about it constructively to see whether or not it's working. That's one of the hardest things to learn as an actual creative person. It's not actually about you.
There's a lot of ego as well, which gets into especially confrontation within the industry itself. It's just like the precious part of, I've put so much work and effort into this particular part, but actually letting it go and let someone else go, you know what, I've got a bigger picture of this story, and that particular bit you've put in, that doesn't sit quite well with the overarching thing. You've got to be able to let it go and go, you know what, it's okay.
100%. And the more you get used to the idea that you can throw things away and it gets better, often throwing things away makes things better. And once you kind of practice that a little bit and get used to it a little bit, you're able to then make better decisions. Like no really great artist did one drawing and go, that's it, I'm done. Great illustrators, great artists, great, film, great directors, great animators. They have done it again and again and again and again. And, a lot of the time what they've done has not been successful and not what they wanted to see, and that it's either not worked and they've discarded it, and then they learnt something from it and they improved through that process. And that's a really important part of that iterative creative process that's really important in animation, and animation has been very good at it for a long time. So, it's all in the development.
No, we've kind of touched on a lot about getting started and that. How do you think, or how do you feel now the industry, especially around Sydney, because you see a lot of Sydney, how do you feel the industry's looking as a whole at the moment? Because we sort of touched on, COVID's closed everything down.
Okay, I have done a few talks on this. there has never been a better time to be working in content creation. If you think about, when I was a kid growing up, we had one screen in our house, and that was the television, and 5 people would be watching that one screen with a couple of channels that you could watch, right? Now, in a household, there's anything up to, there's a screen per person, all watching different levels of content. There's an absolute desire for good content out there. The Netflix, the Stans, everyone is gunning for the standout piece of work. And the challenge with that is that good work often takes time. You can't just, spit stuff out and expect it to be brilliant all the time. And so the better we are, and the more we encourage quality, the better placed we are as an industry in Australia to take advantage of that, that desire for awesome content. And there's been some amazing content produced. So whether it's animation, and right now in COVID, animation is one of those rare spaces, not for all, because, obviously managing your IP doesn't always lend itself to remote work, but certainly in smaller projects, in advertising, in app development, in marketing, in so many other streams, look, a little bit left and right of the traditional sort of film screen industry or television sort of screen style paradigm. If you look left to app development and user experience, if you look right to marketing and the sorts of animation that's being used in marketing and platforms in order to facilitate that, you could leverage that and earn an income in those spaces, and then be working on your own personal projects and IP, if that's what you're passionate about, on the side. It is absolutely, in my experience, one of the best times to be interested in being a screen content sort of creative.
Because the other thing that goes along with that as well is the technology that's come along. It's not out of reach anymore. Because I remember when I started, to get a license for Maya, you'd be spending $2,500 just to get a license for Maya. Whereas now there is free software which you can get hold just to get yourself started and understand what's going on.
100%. But it's about quality. Just using a tool does not make you an artisan. You need to really, get an understanding. And that's where, some courses and, personal research can really help you better understand that. Not everyone, it's not easy for everyone to be able to self-generate, even though it's all out there. Sometimes it's very hard to pick the good stuff from the not so good stuff. And, it's really important to research and make sure that the advice you're getting is sound and that the people you're learning from are sound. And that's a really important part of making sure that when you have those opportunities to use those tools, that you learn how to use them in a way that's really exciting and interesting and can help propel you forward in terms of your aspirations.
Because just following on from that, where we were talking, we're talking about the industry as a whole. The other space which is really opening up now, which I know you wanted to talk a little bit about, is the virtual space. Actually creating storytelling through virtual space. So,
well, for me, we've been doing that in conjunction for many years. So when I'm talking virtual spaces, I'm not just talking VR, although I'm totally talking VR as well. Whether it's virtual reality, augmented reality, whether it's just visual effects, whether it's just animation, whether it's set extensions. So the concept that there is a phrase that I hate in sort of film craft, and that is the term post-production. I know it's very commonly used. It's been well grounded in language. There are companies that call themselves post-production companies. I think as a contemporary piece of syntax or a contemporary piece of language in terms of industry, that it is already redundant, in that often when we say the word production, some people will hear a shoot, other people will hear the whole process. People hear different things when they think of the word production. The other thing is when you say post-production, you relegate it to not an intrinsic part of the development and creative process. So if I'm talking about visual effects, for example, or animation or sound and music, or, it is an end-to-end process. So if you're creating a story and you're going to have For example, it's an integral part of your story. So maybe you're selling an historical piece, and yes, you're going to do some filming, but ultimately, how do you sell that historical piece or make it feel real? Often you'll need some visual effects to make that work for you. And if that's the case, if it's intrinsic to your story, you should be talking to those specialists at the beginning, because they will help you understand how to best utilize that skill set, and that will help you in developing your story. Don't leave it till post. Don't fix it in post, because there is no such thing as post. That is a very antiquated term. And so what we need to get used to is that we're all applying our craft with a bunch of different tools. Some of them are physically in front of us. Some of them are synchronized in time. Some of them are not physically in front of us. Some of them are virtual tools, whether it's software or whatever it is. But we are all joining together to tell a screen story or to produce a visual or whatever it is. And that if it's important to your story, you need to engage those practitioners. If you look at Wall-E, for example, that whole character would not exist without having engaged. How do you develop that character? It doesn't speak words. There is no real script. Its emotional arc is developed and told through a combination of sound and image, and and both of those, in a traditional sense, would be considered post. But they had to work in conjunction right at the head of the storytelling with the storytellers, with the story team, to develop those characters. And that's where the iteration process is. The sound fed off the image fed off the sound fed off the image, and then ultimately you end up with these amazing characters with no script. So, there's my rant about there's no such thing as post.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, that's actually, we've ran ourselves pretty well. We've done a really good session. Is there any last things that you'd like to say about where you are at the moment? To say what things Afters are doing, I'd
love to.
Yeah?
So, I would love to have many more virtual artists aware of of Afters and what we do. So we are, we are Australia's premier screen and radio school, and what we do is we understand the business, and we sit very squarely between very high level excellence in craft and craft skills and very high levels of understanding of how the industry works, how the business works, how to get a show up, how to work with people. And there's a series of courses. If you're a younger person, you could do the BA in screen production and get a taste for all those different crafts. If you're already in your career in virtual craft and you've hit a point where just doing shots on box is not what you love anymore, and you want to be able to develop your own creative voice and understand who you want to be as a creative, absolutely have a look at our master's program. Our Masters of Screen is about getting people who are, somewhat into their career already, who want to really determine themselves as independent, creative screen storytellers and come together and learn from each other. So what you will get the advantage of is having the opportunity, and many virtual artists don't have this, to work, on film sets with other screen professionals, with really amazing screen composers, with really amazing sound teams, with fantastic cinematographers, and develop your own skills. So come and see us.
Awesome. Excellent. So with that, thank you so much for sharing so much of your well-worn wisdom and, expertise with me, Krista. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone who's been watching really gets a lot out of that as well. Like she said, I'll leave a link to our Afters down in the description below. But until the next time where we get to chat to someone else, we'll all say bye-bye.
Ciao for now.